The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
When I grew up, my grandmother had always told us about her father. His name was Nathaniel Schmidt. Now, he had gone on this fantastic adventure with some of his colleagues, and they were Jesse Wrench, Alfred T. Olmsted, and Benson Brush Charles. He was a biblical scholar and a Baptist minister. I decided that this story didn't really completely make sense. There were a lot of missing details. Finally, in 2011, I decided to start researching this event. It took me about 2 years and approximately hundreds of hours of research, combing through archives, books, manuals, personal letters, till I finally pulled it all together. This was the story that I wrote that I thought would best explain what happened on that particular trip. The year was 1904. I was a junior at college at Cornell University. I was 22 years old. I and my cousin Albert, who was a little bit older, a graduate student, and our friend Benson, all went to Jerusalem and the Holy Lands for an entire year. We went with our professor, Nathaniel Schmidt. He was a minister, too. He looked the part with his dark brown beard and mustache. That man could enthrall any crowd. You should have seen the classrooms. They were packed. Standing room only. People were sitting in the windowsills. The public even showed up at these classes. He was brilliant. He knew everything. He was a walking encyclopedia of ancient history, modern history, the Bible, languages, anything to do with the Near East, which helped us greatly many times during our trip. But today, I wanted to tell you about a particular adventure we went on in February of 1905 that year. We had decided to go to the Dead Sea. Now, this is a sea that's between Jordan and Israel, present day. Everyone had told us it was not a good idea to go. It was just dangerous. Our other research colleagues had told us from the other institutes, friends, family, and the travel guides. My favorite was Baedeker's Handbook for Travelers. In that book, he says, the lands between the cultivated areas and the desert proper are filled with marauders who may try to attack you. In the event that this occurs, it is not advisable to kill one of the Arabs, as the entire tribe will seek revenge. We knew it was dangerous, but we had a plan. We were going to rent a boat on the Dead Sea, there were only about 2 of them available. If we saw any trouble, we would just push off into the sea. We would take turns, each of us, 2 hours through the night to keep a lookout. We went to the Dead Sea. We rented a 16-foot rowboat, which the prof called the Dagmar, after his charming little daughter. The boat had to have in it all of the food and water, it was a salt sea, that we needed for 4 men for 3 weeks. Plus our camping materials, supplies, cookware, our blankets. We needed our survey equipment. We had cameras. We had 2 cameras and a tripod. All of our work paraphernalia, reference books, sketchbooks, notebooks, maps. The boat was full. We didn't even have room for a change of clothes. We were going to wear what we had on our backs right now. That's what we'd be sleeping into. But we started our trip. It was a glorious adventure. We first went to the thermal hot springs where Cleopatra and King Herod had bathed. We explored uncharted lands of the Bible. We climbed cliffs and went into caves and climbed right up through the middle of the waterfalls at the great river Arnon. Then, one day, it was my turn to watch the boat, and the others walked down a piece of beach. I missed that day. I'm an archaeologist now. They found Roman ruins of an aqueduct, a sugar mill, and a couple of houses. They were so thrilled, taking photographs and surveying it, making notes, until they noticed that up high on the cliff above them was an Arab looking down at them. Now, of course, they thought, as they saw past the Arab, there was an encampment. This was the kind of savage marauders that they had been warned about might try to kill us. They grabbed all their equipment, ran back to the beach. We threw everything into the boat. But it was the exact wrong time and the wrong location to be getting into the water. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The skies were darkening. A storm was starting to roll in from the northwest. The waves and the winds were coming in, pushing our boat towards the south, and exactly at our south was the Lison Peninsula. Now, the Lison Peninsula is this enormous wall, about 500 feet high, cliff that runs perpendicular into the water and juts out into the Dead Sea for about 5-6 miles. We had nowhere to go. We couldn't go north. We couldn't go south. We had to cross the sea in a storm in the night. And on top of that, our boat was leaking. The day before, the Dagmar had sprung leaks. We were trying desperately to melt some of the asphalt on the beach to fix the holes, but it didn't work. We had to cross the sea because we looked behind us and we saw on that piece of beach we had just been the torchlights of some of the Arabs as they were slowly moving their way up and down the beach. They were obviously looking for us, not suspecting we were out in the sea. We were furiously paddling to keep from being crashed into the cliff, and we made it. It took us 8 hours, bailing water out of the boat, pushing our way towards the western shore. How we got there is beyond me. The prof had an uncanny sense of direction in the pitch dark of night. But we got to the western shore, only to see that there were lights of another camp. We rode another mile or so north to find another encampment. With the last shreds of our strength, we rode yet further until we found an opening where a riverbed was between the cliffs. Not the most ideal place to camp, but we were exhausted. We were wet. It was February. We had no dry clothes to change into. We were hungry. We crashed, but still had to stay post for the night. Wow, how glad we were. By the time the morning came and the sun had come up, we started to gather together our supplies for a breakfast when we saw there was an Arab coming over the beach. He didn't look that scary. He had a smile on his face, and the prof, being the best with dialects of us all, he spoke with them, and the man told us that he was from the Rashidi tribe that lived in Ein-Gedi. But the prof noticed that the man took off to the south when he surmised that Ein-Gedi was up to the north. We didn't pay much attention to it as we were hungry and making our breakfast until about an hour later. 21 swarming men came charging at us over the sand and the rocks. They barely had any clothing on, and each one of them had a knife, a gun, a pistol, a sword, a spear in their hand. We grabbed our things and threw them into the Dagmar, pushed off into the water, but unfortunately it was a bit shallow right there. And the war party came in crashing at the water at us, grabbed hold of the boat, and pulled us back at gunpoint, taking our belongings out of the boat. Well, of course, we thought this was the end of our days, until the prof did something that startled even us. He put his hand on his hip and he said, "Oh, I can see that you are not from the Rashidi tribe that you say you are, and you do not live in Ein-Gedi, the village, but you are the Jahalin tribe, and you live in Sefasif. It is beyond that precipice, past a large rock encampment." And then he went on to describe their camp. Well, you should have seen those Bedouin step back, and they lowered all of their weapons. Who was this white man who knew not only their language but could speak their dialect perfectly? Who knew who they were, where they lived, and could detail their hideout? Well, the prof continued to talk. And as he did so, he slowly maneuvered himself back to the campfire. He told them about other things he knew about the lands where they lived around the Dead Sea. He told them about the thermal hot springs and me pretending to be Cleopatra in the hot thermal waters. And he told us, and he told them about places that we hadn't even been yet. The great salt pillar that's called Lot's Wife, the waterfalls that we went up through in the river Arnon. As he did so, the men sat down, one at a time, around that campfire, to listen to the prof. Then they teased us about our funny clothes, and truth, we were a pretty bedraggled rut by that point. Our clothes had been so badly ripped and tattered on the sharp rocks that we had done all our adventuring and climbing. We hadn't hardly a whole piece of cloth between the four of us. The prof laughed heartily, and we took our cue. We laughed too. And then the leader of the tribe said, "You are a master." And the tribesmen started to salute the prof. They thought he was a great man. And in truth, he was a great man. They said, "You can leave now. We won't harm you." We were so excited. Yes, finally. But no, not the prof. He put up his hand and said, "Oh, but we are with friends, and we are getting to have new acquaintances. We are enjoying ourselves. We will stay a little while longer." He didn't want to give the impression that we were anxious to leave or anything. He didn't think it would look right. A while later, the tribesmen did put our food and our belongings, well, minus some sugar and some lemons, back in our boat. We got back in the Dagmar, the prof sitting tall and erect at the stern, rudder in hand, and we were all waving and smiling goodbye. And I thought, they don't look so much like savages. Why, they look like friends. I never saw the Bedouin the same way ever again. I don't imagine that they saw white men quite the same either again. I always thought that there wasn't a person there that day whose life wasn't in some way forever changed. I know mine was.
Story was given to me by Ruth Debelius, who was the secretary at the school where I was teaching, and she had gotten the story from her boss, the principal of the school, who always said that he was going to write it up and send it to a magazine or something, because he had heard it at the Lions Club or someplace in Ballston Spa. But he didn't do that, and Ruth had no intention of doing it, so she gave me the story, so I'm indebted to her for that. Oh, it was so hot. Oh, it was one of those weeks in the summer when it gets up to 90 and doesn't quit. It was just unbearably hot all day long and into the night. And the little boys in Ballston Spa had just about run out of things that they could do. They were a bunch of them were standing under a tree, and their bicycles were on the ground, and their knickers were unbuttoned, and their shirts were hanging open. And they, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And one of them said, "I've got an idea. Let's go down to the Cateros and go skinny dipping." "Oh," said Art, "you can't do that. Somebody will see us." "Oh, if we go down and walk along the creek till it goes around that bend, nobody's going to walk that far on a day like this. We'll be perfectly safe. Nobody will see us." So they took their bikes and down Blizzard Horse Hill they went, up to the creek, turned right at the creek and went around till it formed that circle around. Oh, would you believe? The Cateros was almost dry. Only mud puddles here and there. Art said, "You can't go skinny dipping in a mud puddle." No, we couldn't. What are we going to do now? Well, Red said, "Let's go up and sit on our veranda. At least it'll be shady up there." So they took their bikes and they trudged up Blizzardorf's Hill. Oh, that's a tough one to do, walk all the way up there. They went over to Gardner's house and they sat on the veranda. Now, Mrs. Gardner knew they were coming, so she was out in the kitchen and she took her cut glass pitcher, nice big pitcher. She went out on the back porch where the ice box was, and she took the ice pick off the nail, and she went over and she opened the compartment where the block of ice was, and she chunked off a nice big piece of ice, and she took that and put it in the cut glass pitcher. Then she picked up all the shards that were on there and put those in the pitcher too. And she went back out in the kitchen and she got a lemon reamer, and she reamed those lemons, got every last bit of drop that she could, and she put the juice in the pitcher, and then she put 2 of the or lemon rinds in for added flavor. She put a whole lot of sugar in and ice cold water. And she put that on the tray with the glasses, started down the long hall. The boys could hear her coming because they could hear the clink of that ice on the pitcher. And they were ready. And so she poured a nice big glass for each one of them. And they took their glass. Oh, it was cold. Oh, it felt wonderful. Oh, it was cold. And then they took a sip, and it was tart, and it was sweet, and it went all the way down. Oh, they made it last just as long as they could. They took tiny, tiny sips. Oh, it was wonderful. But everything comes to an end, and that did too. Now what are we going to do? They had run about through everything they could think of to do. But Hank said, I have a really good idea. Let's go up in the north end and climb up in the water tower and go in there and have a swim in the water tower. Oh, you can't do that, the fellow said. You can't. There are signs all over. Danger, keep out. This means you. No entrance. You can't do that. Oh, who's going to be out to look at? Well, then besides that, we have to cross the Blue Mill Bridge. And you know those North End toughs are just waiting for some kids from the South End. Oh, they'll destroy us. As dumb as they are, do you think that they're going to be standing out there? There isn't a bit of shade for blocks around. Come on, let's go. Get your bicycles and let's go. So down they went, down Milton Avenue, across the Blue Mill Bridge, not a soul there. They went up as far as they could up in the north end. They dropped the bicycles, and there was the fence with all the signs. This means you. But they paid no attention. Over the fence, up the ladder on the front, and around the catwalk, and up the ladder on the back, and into the water. Oh, cool water on their hot bodies. They started to splash themselves. Then they splashed each other. Then they had all kinds of races to see who could last the longest underwater, who could float, all kinds of things. They were having a wonderful time. They were just enjoying themselves. And meanwhile, they had no conception of time. But 3:30 was a magic hour down on the flats in the Ballston Spa, where all the people were working in that beastly hot, waiting for the closing hour. 3:30 was the magic hour. All the people working down there were waiting, watching the clock, waiting for 3:30. Now, down in the sock mill, people didn't have any air conditioning, of course, no fans. And if you opened the window, that only made the woolen lint come through the air and go down in the cuffs of the workers and down in the collars. And it was itchy and hot. And they'd say, close that window. There was no chance of getting a breath of fresh air there. And everybody's waiting for the closing hour. Down in the factory where they made the gloves, the women were pushing that heavy hide through those sewing machines with their hands, and the hides had been dyed, and the dye was coming off on their hands, and as they moved the sweat off their brow and off their face, the dye was coming off too, and they looked like circus clowns, and they felt terrible, but they couldn't go in and wash off or wash their face or their hands because they only got paid for each piece that went through those sewing machines. And if you didn't put a piece through, you didn't get paid at that point. So you kept working, and your eyes would dart up to see the clock. How many minutes more till it was 3:30? But the worst of all was down at the tannery, because down in the tannery they had these beds in the floor, and the beds were full of water with chemicals. And then they would put the hides with the hair still on them right in that mixture, in those tubs down there. And the smell was absolutely disgusting. It was bad enough in the wintertime, but under the conditions of all that heat for day after day after day, it was revolting. And the men kept saying, "Oh, I can't wait to get home and get in the tub or put my head in the sink and get washed up. Oh, I can't wait. It's 18 minutes till it's 3:30. They all knew exactly what time it was. And finally, merciful heavens, it was 3:30, and the workers poured into the streets of Ballston Spa, and they all walked home, thinking, I can't wait. When they got there, they turned on the faucets and the taps and the spigots, and they filled up the tub and the basin and the sink, and there was a sudden demand for water. And that's what the water tower was all about. It was there to provide water for a sudden need. And so the water began to come out into the pipe and away from the water tower. And at first the boys up in the tower didn't notice. They were having such a great time. They didn't notice that the water was going out. And Art said, "Look at me, I've learned to float on my back. And he's pointing up at the top, and the boys looked. And there was the top of the tower. And there they were. Oh, they panicked. They began to shout and carry on and jump, trying to jump, reaching. And of course they couldn't reach that high. And finally one of them said, "Now wait a minute, we've got to get organized here. We've got to go, one fellow stand down on the bottom, another on his shoulders, and another on his shoulders, and make a human ladder, and the last guy up will go over the top and go down to the Union Fire Company. There's sure to be somebody down there that'll help." So Frank Hart, one of those guys, I guess it was Hank. He was a big, strong fellow, and he said, "I'll go down first, and you fellas climb up as fast as you can." But the truth of the matter was, there was a lot of water gone from the tank, but there was a lot of water still on the bottom, and the fellow in the bottom was going to be underwater and would have to hold his breath for quite a while. So Hank went down with his mighty breath of air, and the fellas just scrambled, and they fell off, and finally he had to come up. Could not hold his breath another second. And Art said, "Let me try." And they said, "You're too small. You can't do it, but let me try." So Art went down, and the boys scrambled again, and Art had to come up. He couldn't hold his breath either. Then Steve said, "Now I want to try." Now Steve wasn't really a member of the gang. His folks had just come over from the old country, and they talked funny, and they wore funny clothes, and their food smelled kind of funny too. But Steve was strong, and he knew how to do things too. He said, "Now, you have to be ready. You have to be in line. 1, 2, 3, 4. Fast. You know, no scramble, no scramble. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, we're ready." So Steve went down, and the boys went up 1, 2, 3, 4, and the last one could almost reach the top. And he said, "Come on, fellas, stretch." And they all stretched as much as they could, and he grabbed the top of that and pulled himself up and over, and down he went, down the ladder, and around the catwalk, down the ladder, over the fence, pulled on a pair of pants. Then he picked up any old bicycle, went down the hill, down as far as the Union Fire Company. You know, some of the Whalen fellas were down there, and some of the Thomas boys were there. And when they heard the story, they put the ladder on the rig and got the horse and put the horse on the rig, and away they went up as far as they could go. Then they took the ladder off, went up the ladder, around the catwalk, up the other ladder, and put their ladder down into the water and saved the boys. Now, it's entirely possible that sometime when it was awfully hot, the boys might have decided to go for another swim. But if they did, you can bet your boots that they watched that water level as if their lives depended on it.
Okay, because this is a kind of heartwarming Irish story involving wishes, once again, that we all think of when we think of Ireland.
My heart.
Yes, Emerald Green. It's about a little old lady. And she lived in County Mayo all by herself, except for her little cat Murphy, no relation to myself. And one time she was coming out of church on St. Patrick's Day when she spied a leprechaun hiding behind a stone wall. She crept up behind him and grabbed him, caught him in the twinkling of an eye. And he said, "Oh, you caught me fair and square. I'll give you me pot of gold." And she said, "I don't want your pot of gold. I want 3 wishes." She said, "All right, I'll grant you 3 wishes." And she took him home. And right away she said for the first wish, "I wish I was rich instead of poor." And poof, there were 1,000,000 Irish pounds on the table. And she thought another minute and she said, "I wish I was young and beautiful." And poof, she was young and beautiful. And she had to think for a few more seconds about her final wish. And then she knew. "I wish me little cat Murphy were a handsome young man." And poof, Murphy was a handsome young man. And she said, "Oh, Murphy, is it really you?" "Aye," he said, "'tis. Now, aren't you sorry you had me fixed?" That's the end of that story.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again,